So another idea for teaching this more conventional area of the text was introduced in more detail in the first webinar, and I called it Make It Real. And for those of you who did participate last week, it's when we discussed hexagonal prisms and fabricating that replica of the IKEA lantern. And for those of you who missed it, of course, as you know, we will be notifying you when you can view that webinar online. So basically, though, to make it real for our students, we as teachers need to ask ourselves, how can we bring the content to life for students to observe or discover in a real way? And making the problems concrete in this way will make them more accessible. As Dan Meyer, a math teacher, suggests, it'll level the playing field for all of our students because it becomes more about an experience rather than about reading material. So luckily, the teacher resource for MathWorks often has fantastic teaching ideas for bringing lessons to life. So let's look at an example. Here's an Explore the Math lesson. It's from the same section on mean, median, and mode. So here you can see the discussion of the mean, and then it moves on over the page to discuss median, mode, and measure of central tendency. So to apply the jigsaw strategy, it's easy to divide up this lesson because there's 4 terms. So the lesson naturally divides itself into 4 different pieces. So therefore, each student can be assigned one piece. We have the mean expert, the median expert, the mode expert, and then finally the person who's going to become the expert on measure of central tendency. So all the students across the classroom who are designated to become let's say, the median experts, they'd all meet together, make sure they know what median is, have lots of great examples, be able to define it, be able to teach it, and then once they feel comfortable, cooperative learning groups would form again, and they would teach it to their peers in that group. And then, of course, the next person would have a turn, the person who's the mean expert or the mode expert, etc. To use the Make It Real strategy here, you can turn to the teacher resource for support, and this, if you did that, this is what you would find. There are some great activities here that target different types of learners. So this first one on kinesthetic learners talks about bringing in a jar of stones and asking each student to come up and take a handful and then count out how many was in their handful. And that would provide a data set for which you could then calculate as a class the mean, median, mode. For visual learners, there's a neat idea about measuring smiles. So you take a piece of string and measure along the bottom of your smile, and then collect the data and put it in order so that you literally have, the student with the shortest smile can stand on one end and up to the student with the widest smile on the other end. So you have a physical data set, and then once you've calculated your mean, median, and mode, those students can identify themselves, on the mean, and it creates a strong visual representation of the meaning of these mathematical terms for students. Furthermore, the teacher resource, in lots of places you'll see remediation strategies, and here if you look on the top right-hand corner, you'll see that here there's a way of teaching for students who might be struggling with this concept. What's more, lots of places in the teacher resource will even have blackline masters, such as this one, and these are available to give extra practice or to simplify things a little more because they have smaller sets of numbers. For example, here the numbers themselves are smaller. There's less context in it, so it's just a simplified way of teaching it to some of the students, and that's right in the teacher resource. So another element that's really well suited to whole class discussion, or sorry, examination rather, is discuss the ideas. It follows the Explore the Math lesson, and it's a continuation, sometimes a completion even, of the lesson material that has been introduced. And it applies a real life situation to that material. So, and again, instead of moving just straight into this whole class discussion where you have, some students playing on their phones and some students hiding and only a few hopefully with you, to encourage all students to sort of engage in what's happening or to be at least accountable for what's happening, we can try a couple other cooperative learning strategies. So one strategy is called carousel, And it works really well when the Discuss the Idea section has multiple questions. So several questions that you're looking at or several pieces to that question. And you want as many questions as you have groups. So again, the ideal for cooperative learning is 4, but 3 could work. 5 can also be fine. And what you do is you take all, say you had 5 groups of 4, you'd want 5 questions, and you would have 5 pieces of chart paper, and at the top of each piece of chart paper you'd write 1 question. So then at the end of that you want to distribute them around the room. So you'll have 5 groups, 5 pieces of chart paper with the questions distributed around the room. And then the groups are literally going to physically rotate themselves from question to question. So they'll start at 1 chart paper, work as a group to jot down some answers to that question, and then once everyone's had some time to work on that, they rotate to the next question until they've had a chance to work through all of the pieces. At the end, you want to ask the group that sort of finished there and say, okay, could you read and summarize what all the groups have answered in response to this question? And then you can have a larger whole class discussion about the responses and that type of thing. Draw conclusions, in other words, as an entire class. Another idea for encouraging all students to participate in what will subsequently be the whole class discussion is called placemat. Now, unlike carousel, this is actually better when you have just 1 central question to examine. And this, you want to have 3 or 4 students per group. What you do is you give them a great big sheet of paper. 11 by 17 is usually enough. Sometimes you might need a great big chart paper, and you ask them to divide it in this way. So in the middle, draw a circle, and then actually the rest of the piece of paper is going to be divided into however many sections there are students, right? So if you have 3 students, you would only divide it into 3 sections instead of 4, as you see here. The first part of this is to give students some silent working time. So they're going to think to themselves and write in their section their thoughts on whatever the question at hand is. So there's this individual response time. After that, they get a chance to share with the other people in their group. This is what I wrote, this is why I wrote it, this is my understanding, and they are going to make a consensus, come together with their understanding and write that in that middle bubble or that middle circle. That is what then gets shared with the entire class and gets discussed. So let's look at an example of these two. I have 2 examples here from Chapter 8, Owning a Small Business, and then this first one, it talks about profitability, what choices an owner can make in order to get more customers and make more money. And as you can see at the bottom there's a whole bunch of different factors, 8 factors that it asks students to consider. So that's perfect because there's lots of things to consider. Those could be thrown up at the top of each of your pieces of chart paper, or you could combine a few if you need to, if you have less students and that kind of thing. And then, again, students would rotate around and consider at each station, okay, what about number of staff? How can adjusting that influence profitability? And before, at the end, you can have a full class discussion after each of the groups has responded to the different things. Okay, in the next idea, in the next example, discuss the ideas. The central question is, as a small business owner, should you buy a vehicle or lease a vehicle? What are the benefits to each? And this would work well with the placemat strategy. Students would have already studied this in the Explore the Math lesson, looked at buying versus leasing, and so now they can form an opinion and have a few minutes to silently write, what they think is good about each, what would they do, that kind of thing, and then discuss that with their group, come to a consensus in that central circle we saw there, and then that is what gets shared with the whole class, and that's from where the whole class discussion ensues from that point. So we've finished whole class, now we're on to the small group work. So one of the pieces of MathWorks that works really well with small group is the project. It just with MathWorks 10 and 11, MathWorks 12, you'll find it at the beginning of each chapter, and it applies the content of the chapter to a real-world situation. They're definitely conducive to small group work or sometimes partner work, and they're meant to be worked on in stages over the course of the chapter. In the student resource, they're actually divided into multiple steps, and they always end with a final presentation, so a sharing of work. They can be used by teachers as an additional way to assess students' understanding of the mathematical knowledge in a real-world application, or sometimes you might even consider doing it as an alternative way altogether and perhaps not doing the traditional unit test. So in the teacher's resource, there's lots of great support for projects. As a possible major assessment task, you'll find things like a rubric, student self-assessment sheets, student checklists, data collection tables, and even if you don't like the project that's presented in the chapter, or you want to give your students choice, or they did it last year, or whatever the case may be, there's actually an alternative chapter project and a whole other set of supporting materials available at the end of the chapter in the teacher resource. So these are broken down in the student resource throughout the chapter, so you'll see like an overview like this and a checklist, and then that getting started step. This one's about designing a board game, so a group of about 4 or 5 students would work well. You have to not only develop the game, but also work a bit on marketing it specifically. So after this gets started, it's just sort of the market research part. You know, you want to ask your students in the class, their fellow classmates, you know, what are your interests? If it turns out everybody is really into skateboarding, they might decide, okay, our board game is going to target students interested in skateboarding and design it from there. Then to keep track of their work, you can give them the project checklist. This has all the final materials on it. And in fact, it would probably be best to give this out at the beginning when the project is introduced so that they can keep track as they go and make sure they have everything. That space on the side can be used to say, okay, you know, Susan is going to do this section, and then Bill is going to follow up and do the following section, that kind of thing, so they can use that blank for that purpose. It will continue in your textbook. You'll see another intermediate step. This one's got part 1 and 2, develop the game, so make a prototype. And here's your math. They are asked to play the game 10 to 20 times to gather experimental probability data. Finally, the part 2 is test your game, so that's when they go back to their market, all those skateboarding fans, and say, okay, here's our skateboarding game, can you play it, and give us feedback, what works, what doesn't, and they're going to modify their game as necessary and write a report about how they did that. So here, again, lots of this stuff is just ready and available in the teacher resource. This is a data collection chart for when they do play it that 10 to 20 times and collect their data on experimental probability. They can record the results right here. And then finally, the last part is always presenting to the class, and in this case, we'll be playing the game. The teacher resource support does include a lot of assessment support, and you'll see a project rubric for each of the projects. And it's not just for assessing the mathematical calculations, it's also for assessing all the pieces of the project together. And you can use it just as it is, or you can modify what you have as you see fit. This may perhaps be a newer experience for some math teachers, both using a rubric, but maybe also assessing something, you know, the project as opposed to just the mathematical understanding. So the easiest way that I have found to mark using a rubric is actually to photocopy this sheet as many times as you have assignments. So if you have five groups going to submit board games to you, you would copy it 5 times. Then as they present, that was actually the bottom section there, communication, presents work and explanations clearly. So you'd have a highlighter in hand, and as they present, you're going to highlight phrases that apply. Yes, they use some appropriate mathematical terms. I'm going to highlight that as they present to you. When they hand in their materials, you staple this to their front, and later when you're marking the rest of the project, you do the same thing. You go through with the highlighter and just highlight short phrases in whichever column is applicable. So then at the end, you sort of have a little pockmarked piece of paper, and you can convert that qualitative data to quantitative. For example,